managers and directors, I started to interview every single person in the organization who would sit down with me. And what I found out was that we had a mattering issue.
People are chasing titles, money.
What I found was that employees were all order takers. They weren't order makers.
Why do you think momentum is such a key aspect of progress? John, it is such a pleasure to have you on Transform Your Workplace. Thanks for coming on.
Brandon, it's such an honor to be here. Thank you for allowing me to come and serve your audience.
It's always fun to talk to another podcaster too. And we're going to talk about your show a little bit later, but you've had such an interesting career, very diverse career compared to a lot of people I talk to. Military officer, Fortune 50 exec, entrepreneur, you're an author, podcast host, a very successful podcast host. What about that journey led you to this mission of wanting to help people build more intentional lives in workplaces?
I believe we're best positioned to serve the person we once were. And that is exactly what happened to me. When I came out of the military, the farthest thing from my mind was going down the path to becoming, a C-level in a Fortune 50 company. I left the military because I had an opportunity to go become an FBI agent. And I thought I was going to be kicking down doors, that sort of thing. But funny thing about life is sometimes it throws you twists that you never expected. And that's exactly what happened to me. Literally 3 days before my Quantico class, out of the blue, my detailer calls me up and says, Congress isn't passing the budget. We see this all the time now. Back then, it didn't happen that much. But out of caution, we're recycling your class. And I had no idea what that meant. I thought, okay, well, I go in the next class. It was over 36 months later before I got the call to go back and do a class. And at that point, life had kind of taken its course. So I had gone into management consulting at that point because I needed an income. I had a newborn. I was in my MBA. So I went down this track I never, ever expected. And I think it's something that happens to a lot of us. You end up living this life. This is what self-discrepancy theory calls that you should be living, kind of what society tells you is success, but it's not the life that you could be leading. And that's where I found myself. I was definitely on this path where I had achieved what I felt I should be doing. And I had done it with incredible success. I had reached, like I mentioned, the pinnacle of being a C-level in a Fortune 50 company. It doesn't get much higher than that unless you're the CEO. And from then, I became a partner in a private equity firm and then went on to lead 2 or 3 of the business units as the CEO. But all along that way, I felt this disconnection, and people call it burnout, but it was something that I couldn't describe. I felt more like I was just disconnected from the true life I was supposed to lead. And I think it's what Henry David Thoreau years ago called quiet desperation, where you find yourself in this spot where you're like a fish out of water and you're desperate to find and return to becoming this ideal self that you dreamt of as a kid. And so what I ended up doing is I ended up making that intentional choice to step into crossing that chasm of the life I should be leading to what I could be leading. And that path, that journey that took me about 2 years is what I document in my book, Passion Struck. And now it's really what I'm trying to help people, because there are all kinds of people who are facing this path. It's the corporate executive like myself, could be the nurse who has found herself or himself not doing what they ever imagined they would do and they feel trapped. It could be practically anyone. So that is who I'm trying to help.
Yeah, I mean, hearing you talk about all those accolades and just reaching that level of achievement, you seem like you had it all too. But if there was something, did you knew there was something missing, or that you were maybe chasing something that was never going to really quite fulfill you? Like you said, there was a 2-year period where you were kind of reflecting, like what was that process for you and figuring out what you wanted, maybe your North Star, so to speak?
Well, before we go into that, I just want to kind of describe problem as I see it. There's so much now, and I know you talk to a lot of HR departments on employee disengagement and burnout and everything else. And we've mistaken all of this, especially burnout, disengagement, as a workload problem. But what if the real issue is a worthload problem? That is what I believe is at the crux of this. And I recently interviewed Shige Oishi, who's one of the leading behavioral scientists in the world on mattering. And we were talking about this dilemma, and he told me, in order for your life to matter, it has to not matter just to you, but to others. And that's the quiet epidemic in workplaces today. It's feeling invisible.
Yeah.
They're like me. You show up, you produce, but you don't feel seen. And so, but once you're stuck in the trap, it's so hard to get out of it. And for me, it finally took an incredible wake-up call, 2 events in the matter of 1 week that shook me to my core. I was faced with the unfortunate event of an intruder in my house was robbing me because they expected me to be somewhere else, and I showed up unexpectedly, escaped that, and then just a few days later, one of my closest friends committed suicide. And it really made me question, I've been spending all of this time making other people's dreams and wealth come true. Why aren't I doing it for myself? And so that sent me on this path. I didn't think it was going to take 2 years, but I think when you want to invoke real change, you have to start where I start in my book, and that's becoming a mission angler. What is the mission in life that you're supposed to tackle? And I don't know about you, but that doesn't happen overnight. It happens through experimentation. And it happens by getting rid of the invisible load of crap that most of us build up in your life. For different people, it's different things. For me, it was trauma that I had suppressed because that's kind of what I had learned and been shown to do. And in order for me to move forward, I had to get rid of that stuck point or stuck points that were holding me back. So my initial focal point was I started down the path of how do I finally deal with all this trauma, including the death of my friend, the trauma of being held up at gunpoint. But what it really unearthed was my combat trauma and earlier traumas from my life that I had suppressed. And so I went through cognitive processing therapy, thought that sucked. And then I went through prolonged exposure therapy. That sucked even more. And then EMDR and other things. But when I finally got through all that, what I realized as I was working through it is when you start working on one issue of your life, you end up working on multiple areas of your life through that process. And that's what I try to teach people is you just need to pick an anchor point. And from that anchor point, once you start making traction, you can naturally pivot into other areas.
The book is called Passion Struck. What do you mean by passion struck?
And so some of your listeners may know of a friend of mine, Keith Crotch. Keith, I met him almost 30 years ago when he was the CEO and founder of a company called Ariba. He sold it to SAP. People probably know him the best from one of his subsequent roles. He was the CEO and chairman at DocuSign and then became the undersecretary of state under Trump's first administration. But I was having this conversation with Keith about my life and about trying to help people. And I described it as throughout this process of my own self-work and writing of the book, I ended up going down this path where I started to look at what makes a bold leader a bold leader. And I started analyzing 50, 60 people and was writing about it in this thing called the Bold Leader Spotlight. And then I decided to shift it. Like, was there a correlation between a bold leader and a bold leader in their personal life? And what I found was pretty striking. Some people manifested it in both places. Some people didn't, but I came up with this framework of what is it that makes someone really chase a problem that they feel personally compelled to solve to the point that they're willing to risk their wealth, their reputation, their relationships to go after it. And I was explaining this concept to Keith, and he says to me, John, it sounds like you're talking about someone who's stuck and they become passion struck. And I'm like, that's exactly it. And so I did what anyone would do at that point. I immediately looked up the word phrase to see if it was trademarked or a web domain. And shockingly, at that point, Victoria's Secret had a perfume called Passion Struck, but no one had trademarked it and no one had taken the domain name. So I immediately knew it was an act of God coming in to create it. So that became the brand from that point forward. And what my real mission is just as Disney has worked to create the most happy place on earth with their theme parks, I am trying to create the most intentional.
And in the book, you lay out 12 powerful principles to help people live more intentionally. Of those principles, since we can't really talk about all of them, which one do you think leaders or individuals who are on this journey that you perhaps like once went through, what do they need to hear the most right now?
Yeah, so the way that the book is organized is it has 6 mindset shifts, 6 behavior shifts, and then the third part of the book is really implementing this using what I call a deliberate action process, but it's really about how do you activate intrinsic motivation, which is the flame behind Passion Struck. But if you go into the mindset shift section, I mentioned one before, the mission angler. It then goes into the fear confronter, and then into something called the Mosquito Auditor. And I think people like the Mosquito Auditor chapter because as you're on this journey of reshaping your career, reshaping your life, it's one thing to confront fear, but one of the things that typically blocks you more than anything is your habits, is your people in your life who you hang out with, who have the biggest influence on you. And so as I started to think about, like, how do I talk about this? I was on a walk with my dog and listening to a radio show, and the announcer comes on and says, what is the most dangerous animal on the planet? And the audience members are calling in saying, it's this jellyfish in Australia, or it's this poisonous snake, or the shark, or something like that. And then after a number of people called in, he says, no, it's none of those. It's the mosquito. The mosquito kills almost 2 million people per year. It's more than all shark deaths will happen in a century. And I just sat there and I'm like, it's so interesting because when you think about a mosquito, they're so benign. Yes, they bother us, but we never really think they'll hurt us. We try to swat them away, but oftentimes we don't really feel their presence until they bite us. And I started to think, the same thing about places we frequent, the people in our lives. And so I decided to go down the path of defining 3 of these mosquitoes, and I called them the invisible suffocator, the blood sucker, and the pain in the ass. And the invisible suffocator are those people in your life who are the glass half empty type of people, who you go to them with this idea of, I've got this great opportunity, or I want to go on this health kick that I want to explore. And they give you all the negative reasons why you can't do it. The PETA are those people, I always equate them to the clients that I had or I have now, where you might have 20 clients you're working with, but they think that they're the only one who exists, and they want to take up all your time, and they just run you dry of emotional availability. And I refer to those as the pain in the asses, but they're also the activities that you do that get in your own way. And then there's the most devastating, which are the blood suckers. This is what my friend Terry Cole calls the boundary destroyers, because what they're after is to drink every ounce of blood that they have to get whatever that they want that's going to fulfill them or meet their objectives at your expense. And why I think these are three great analogies is you can apply them to your activities. Do you have the habit of getting off work and going to a bar every day? Or you can apply them to the people in your life. And what I tell people to do is start with the people closest to you and pretend like you're shooting a gun or shooting archery and you're looking at a bullseye, and start putting the 5 closest people to you in the bullseye and do an exercise. Are any of them the mosquitoes that I just mentioned? Then go to the next circle, the next circle. And once you identify them, it is such a gift because, as I explained with Terry Cole, kind of the expert on boundaries, now you can start putting boundaries in place, whether it's with these people or whether it's with your activities now that you audit them.
There's a quote I found in the book that I loved, and I thought it illustrated this point of passion struck pretty well. The quote says, "Amidst the vast game of life, many individuals find themselves lost in the action phase. They become consumed by the never-ending cycle of busyness, failing to align their actions with their aspirations and ambitions. In doing so, they lose sight of the greater purpose and potential that awaits them." End quote. Why do you think momentum is such a key aspect of progress in our lives as individuals, as leaders? Curious what you think about that.
Well, let's look at it in a counterintuitive way. People don't leave jobs because of tasks. They leave because of emotional subtraction, the slow erosion of significance. And, the person who's done the most work here is Amy Edmondson, who teaches at Harvard, and her research on psychological safety, which revealed that teams don't fail because of incompetence, they fail because of silence. When people don't feel safe to speak up, they stop contributing, and eventually they walk out the door. Well, the same thing happens in your own life. If you don't have positive momentum in keeping that momentum going, you end up starting to get emotional subtraction. And that emotional subtraction starts eating away at your significance and the path that you're trying to go on. So that's why momentum, in my opinion, is so important, because it keeps this building block of momentum going.
I think there's this underlying idea in your book that people are chasing titles, money, saying yes to everything that comes across just because they think that's forward progress, but they do it all without purpose. What's the danger in forward progress without any sort of purpose in our lives?
Well, it's the same thing as trying to cross the English Channel, yet not knowing where England is when you start from France, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're going through all the motions of trying to take your life to the next level, or your career, or it could be a project that you're working on at work. And I call it this concept of we become a visionary arsonist to our own hopes and dreams. Meaning we end up having these huge aspirations that we want to achieve, these huge goals, but what do? We start arsoning the things that allow us to get there. I mean, it's the same thing as a marathon runner saying that they want to complete a marathon, yet they aren't doing the work in the weeks and months leading up to it. Instead of running 2 miles, they run 1, or they don't run at all. Mm-hmm. Instead of eating healthy, they're eating junk food. I mean, we do the same thing all the time in all areas of our life. We arson those things that matter most to us. So that's why I think intentionality is so important. Intentionality is the same thing that Angela Duckworth would call self-control. So in her words, you can have all the passion and perseverance which make up grit that you want. But in my words, if you're not using self-control or intentionality to direct it, you're either going to go absolutely in the direction that you want, or you're going to go in the opposite direction. As Robin Sharma once told me, you can be obsessed with your phone, or you can be obsessed with making a difference in the world. You can't do both.
Yeah, that's well put. Robin is very, very wise. You coined this idea of the mattering revolution. Unpack this for me. Like, what are you trying to accomplish with this?
So when I started to analyze my own life, years before I ever started to do that, I really started to double down in looking at faith and spirituality in ways that I never had before. And so I started really doing a deep dive into The Power of Myth by Joseph Campbell. And I started studying the Bible, and I started studying other religions, Buddhism, Muslim. Like, what did all these things have in common? And as I was going through that, I started to get these quiet signs that were coming back to me that people were hurting throughout the world. And the words that were kind of emerging in my mind were people were feeling lonely. Well, fast forward, we're in a loneliness epidemic. People were feeling hopeless. Well, I think you could say we're in a hopelessness epidemic. People were feeling burned out, broken, battered. And as I started to analyze this, all of these were symptoms of something bigger. And that something bigger to me is what Gordon Flett, who's a retired professor from the University of York in Canada, termed antimattering. We have lost our sense of mattering in life. And I think that is at the core of what is happening to so many people. And I don't think it's a small number of people. I actually think it's billions of people. And so for me, my journey now is to create a revolution of people feeling valued and adding value. And to me, it's the strongest lever to reverse the disengagement crisis that so many people are feeling. Because the biggest area that we're disengaged with more than any is with ourselves. Because we're so distracted. It's something that I call in the book, people aren't living on autopilot. At least when you're on autopilot, you're going in a positive direction. I think people are directionless. They're living like a pinball.
Yep.
And instead of playing the game, they are in the middle of the game being bounced around. And so that's what mattering is all about. It starts with, how do you reclaim personal mattering, like mattering to yourself? And then from there, you can start rebuilding back a mattering framework in your life. So that's what the Mattering Revolution is all about. And I have been working hardcore on a children's book that I'm releasing here at the end of this year, and my next novel, which will be really a whole book focused on how do you start rebuilding all the substructures that you need to have mattering back in your life, in your workplace, in your family, in your community.
I so appreciate that work that you're doing. Especially with the children's book, because I think it really starts with kids and how they're developing. And like right now, I'm reading a book, the Anxiety Generation, I think that's what the title is, and it's just how social media and technology have like completely disconnected people. Like they think they're more connected than ever, but it's actually making us more isolated and anxious than ever. And those kids grow up to become workers in our businesses and in our society. And if we're more isolated and we feel like we don't matter, that is a big problem. So I appreciate the work that you're doing. What are some signs that leaders and other people who oversee people or work directly with people, what are some signs of this crisis of disconnection? Like, what are the signs that pop up?
Yeah. So is the book you're reading by Jonathan Haidt, The Anxious Generation?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great book. So just if I can just add one thing in,
Please.
I think he has done a great job, because I've read the book, of defining what the issue is. I think Robert Putnam in Bowling Alone laid this all out in the 80s. Bob Waldinger has kind of given us this understanding that it's connection that needs to be there. But what I am creating in this book is I'm telling you how to rebuild it. Yeah. I think they've done a great job at showing what the issue is. I think that's table stakes. I think what people are looking for is, how do you rebuild it at work? So to me, I will go back to this story. So it's a story I haven't told yet, but I was vice president at Lowe's. I had just been hired because Lowe's had undergone at that point the worst hacking incident in retail history. Two people had hacked into an access point outside a store and had gotten all the way to the mainframe and the general ledger of the company before they got thwarted. And when I took on this job, I thought I was going to be solving the operational issues around it. But when I took over the group that I was leading, within the first week, I get called in to the head of HR, and I think she's going to give me this rundown of my direct reports, which she did. But more importantly, she said, on top of everything else, we just did this employee disengagement survey, the first one the company's ever done. And guess what? You've got the most disengaged group in the entire company, 350,000 employees. You've got the most disengaged groups. And I'm like, wow, now not only do I get to clean up the worst security event in history, now I have to clean up this whole group. But when I got into it, to answer your question, I started to ask all my peers and business customers, what's wrong with the group? And they're like, your people don't care. They're worthless. They're not talented. You need to redo the whole group, all your leadership, etc. But then I did the step that most leaders don't do, is I started to not just interview my managers and directors. I started to interview every single person in the organization who would sit down with me. And what I found out was that we had a mattering issue.
Yeah.
And where that mattering was impacted the most was with the managers, because the managers were completely burned out. Not only that, they were completely misaligned. They had no idea how whatever they were doing was benefiting the customer, was benefiting the strategy of the company. And so because they were tuned out and they were disengaged, of course, their employees underneath them are. So what I try to tell any organization is that I think the most important position you've got to observe is your frontline managers. Mm-hmm. Because you need to look specifically, are they emotionally engaged or not? Do they have too much work on them? Are they showing up in the way that they know what's going on with their people? Like if you do, and so what I think companies need to do is they need to start really focusing on that group. And whether it's through surveys, whether it's through performance metrics that are observing their own mattering, they really need to look at that core group, because if that group is tuned out, then the employees underneath them are. And then from there, you obviously would go to the directors and then up the chain of command. But I think there can be a completely engaged SVP, and underneath them, a couple levels below, are completely disengaged, because that senior vice president isn't doing something that I talk about in the Passion Struck book, is they're not speaking with their feet. They might be managing up, they might be managing across, but are they getting down in the weeds, and are they really talking to people? Are they skipping over the director and VP at times to talk to those managers in the organization and to get a pulse on, are they overworked? Do they understand what their purpose is? Are they themselves feeling fulfilled? And so that's what I would encourage people to do.
If leaders like yourself, actually put in that much work to interview as many people as you possibly can, get a sense of what's causing the disengagement? Are you engaged? Are your people disengaged? And then if you uncover that there is a level of disengagement at that leadership level, but it's also trickling down, what are some practical steps to re-engage people? And are there some pitfalls in terms of we think this might help re-engage people, but it actually does the opposite?
Well, I think this is going to be the next book I write after the workplace, after this mattering book, because I have the blueprint.
Good.
I took that group. Not only did we fix the security issue, but we took that group from worst in the company to second best in a matter of 2 years. And I came up with what ultimately was going to be a 5-year strategy. I got promoted to a different role before I got to implement the whole thing in that group, but I've been using it ever since. And I think the first thing that you have to do is you have to be vulnerable with the people who are impacted. You have to start showing up in a way that they start feeling seen, that they were heard. And what I found was that these employees were all order takers. They weren't order makers. And they were reliant on someone else telling them what to do instead of feeling like they were empowered to make the change. So I started communicating 20 times more than I ever thought I would. And this was me doing it started out with an all hands meeting for everyone in the organization, but I would go to directors' staff meetings. I would go to manager staff leading meetings. I would show up in a data center at 2:00 in the morning. I'd show up in a call center at 5:00 at night. It didn't matter. I was just trying to go and re-amplify the message. And then in every single staff meeting I kept emphasizing the same things till it was, the directors were like, we don't need to hear it again. But the importance was they needed to be echoing it.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I got crystal clear on with everyone was we started to do a line of sight so that every single employee knew explicitly why their job mattered, what their role was, and why it made a difference to the company and to the customer. And then on top of it, we also implemented what I now call in the book Gardner leadership. I think there's a big difference between being a servant leader and a Gardner leader. And the biggest difference is a Gardner leader is like a gardener. You're there to cultivate your crops, but you can't micromanage them. So this is where you need to be eyes on and hands off. You need to be eyes on to the point that you're telling people the vision, you're telling people what the goals that you're trying to accomplish, but you need to be hands off. You can't expect a software developer to fully explode their creativity if you're breathing down their throat on exactly how to do the job. It's the same thing with a systems engineer or a security engineer or a person who's working on the factory floor. They're the ones who are doing the job. So you've got to give them the ability to come up with new ways of doing it and have a leadership team that's open to hearing what they have to say. And that was one of the biggest feedback loops for me, because mattering is relational. It's not one way. And that requires a feedback loop for the leadership team to listen and then echo back what their team is telling them and to help. So those would be some of the things I would start with.
A couple more things for you, and then I'll let you go. As of today, I looked, the Passion Struck podcast, you have 592 episodes. That's incredible. As a podcast host, I've got over 520. I know the work that goes into it, so congratulations on that. But you've hosted a lot of great guests: Gary Vaynerchuk, Angela Duckworth, Ryan Holiday, Amy Edmondson, like probably Seth Godin too. I saw his face somewhere on your website. Like, incredible lineup. Do you have a favorite episode or one idea that has come through the podcast that has just completely changed your perspective on all of your work and just how you see engagement and in the workplace?
Yeah, I would say a recent one that I did. I've had so many favorites, and Seth has been on twice, and I don't interview Seth about marketing. Well, I'll talk about Seth because I think it's a good segue. I was going to say Shige Oishi, and I would just put it out there. If you haven't read his book on psychological safety, it's an awesome book, and he kind of takes what Ed Diener, Laurie Santos, Sonja Lubernitsky have done, and he kind of goes down this path that happiness is all those things that those people research, but it's missing this thing called psychological safety. Mm-hmm. So that's a great teaser for that episode in his book. But I'll go down. I've interviewed Seth twice. One was on Climate Almanac, where we talked about the horsemen that are causing climate issues. And then I talked to him about his book on the need to have mattering in the workplace, because that's really what it was about. But in both of these, I think what struck a chord to me more than anything, and it's what led me to write this book, is if you're going to fix climate change, if you're going to fix disengagement, if you're going to fix these things that are happening in the world, it requires systems change. And systems change starts with one person. So a great example of this is I had this gentleman on the show, Dr. Abraham George. I'd never heard of him. He listened to the show. He's based in India, really wanted to come on, and I'm so glad I had him come on. This is exactly what Seth is talking about. So you have this, he's got a doctorate degree, and for years, his doctorate is around economics, and he had a very great career. But he said to me that he was creating the career because he knew he needed the money to make the impact that he wanted to have. So he started to see all these people in India who, because of the caste that they're born into, the life that they're born into, don't have any future beyond the caste system. And he said, I am going to change this. So he started this school called Shanti Bhavan, and he started it out himself. He started himself teaching the classes. And now, 20-something years later, he has impacted 15,000 students. These are now students who are going to Ivy League schools, and they're going to the University of Michigan and other high-level places. They're now doctorates and authors. And to me, it just shows this ripple effect that one person who realizes that their impact can matter can change so many lives, and then those lives change lives. And that's exactly what Seth was talking about with climate change is it all starts with us individually. But more importantly, it starts changing when the systems start changing. So if companies stop judging themselves on shareholder value and on expenses and top line growth and those metrics, and we start judging them on what difference that they're making to the climate, things are going to change, because business is the main culprit more than any government for why we have the climate dilemma. So it's going to take a change, systematic change in the way that companies are evaluated to make this shift happen. It's no different than me saying managers need to be evaluated in some way or form on a mattering aspect of their work. If not, it's never going to be dealt with. It's not going to be measured. And if you're not measuring it, it's never going to be fixed. So I would say Seth for those reasons.
It's well said. Seth is a very wise man. I've read, he's written a lot of books. I think I've probably read 6 or 7 of them. Always good stuff. And he, like, early on in my marketing career too, like, a lot of what he's talking about is just ship it, like ship the work, like it's the actions behind it. And even if it's not perfect, just get it out the door. So people who will actually resonate with your work and they'll actually consume it. And those who it's not for them, that's okay. It's not for them. That always stuck with me. And so I was always like, I'm just going to put it out there. And just he's a very, very, very smart guy. So,
yeah, he, on so many different dimensions. And the funny thing about when I interviewed him and when I interviewed Robin, I've had Robin on a couple times too, Sharma. They both told me after the episodes I did with them, this is the last book I'm ever going to write. I'm done. Right. And then they both write books right after it. I'm like, you guys are kidding me.
John, where can listeners learn more about the Mattering Revolution, your book Passion Struck, everything else that you're up to, and perhaps when you write that next book, where can people learn more about what you're working on right now?
So I very much appreciate that. The best 2 places to go are, if you want to learn more about me and my mission, you can go to my website, John, middle initial R Miles. My Instagram post every single day, John R Miles as well. And if you want to learn about Passion Struck podcast, more things Passion Struck, go to passionstruck, STRUCK.com.
My guest has been John R Miles, the author of Passion Struck, host of the Passion Truck podcast and founder of the Mattering Revolution. John, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Brandon, for having me. It was such an honor to be here.